I turn off my yeah.
Hi, everyone. For all of you joining, if you're new to the Regenerative Iteration channel, we tend to take about the first 5 minutes just to let the conversation just free flow, and we'll get started about five after, between 5 to 7 after or so. And that's just to give everyone time to come into the room and get their bearings. So by all means, chat amongst yourselves, and we'll start around 5 after.
Nice to see you, Brian. Hello, Alex.
Good morning.
And Michelle, of course. Wonderful. So glad you're here, particularly for next week. I just said to Sage a few minutes ago, this is going to be a real turn from the geometry discussion that was at the end of the other GRC governance call. So, be prepared for whiplash.
What was the nature of the geometry conversation?
Well, the idea that that in fact organizations and energies you really are reflecting sort of basic geometrical principles, and what holds and what kinds of structures hold it, and this whole idea of torus. I mean, Michelle is much more conversant about talking about it, but that in many ways, we are patterns of living systems, and living systems at the end of the day are geometrical relationships. Hello, Jesse. Glad you could join here as well.
Hi, thanks, Lynn.
Did you talk at all about biogeometry?
I came in late, so I'll turn it to someone who was in the meeting.
Mandalas.
Yeah.
I don't think we spoke about that. Sage, I could be wrong, but very interested. And we're gonna geek out at another meeting on on this stuff. So if anybody's interested in talking, yeah.
Right. And it was biogeometry would apply. The idea is because we were in a governance call, and the geometry that reflects regenerative systems is a torus, and the torus contains lots of other patterns, such as infinity symbol, such as spirals, circles, and all of that, and the seed of life, geometric pattern, and all these. And then someone said, wouldn't it be cool to compare the geometric patterns of non-regenerative, organizations or governance structures, and see what we could learn? Like, why isn't it? And the thing that came to mind. Well, I don't want to go on. I don't want to spoil it
for another time.
Brian, Brian, it was just kind of offered as an idea in the future. It hasn't been scheduled yet, because I know you're saying when.
Yeah, it hasn't been scheduled. It's really just, and so I think there's going to be a conversation, like, to talk about how to plan the thing. But of course, here everything, we're all just talking all the time. So anybody's welcome to the conversation about the conversation. Let's see. And if anybody wants to see, where did it go, Michelle? I'm about to post the chat text from that meeting, and there's some quite good links in that text. So encourage folks to know that, just to know that there's some good, useful links in there.
Dr. Brian, I think you'd love to hear that I finally, on the 8th of September, will have a one-to-one initial chat with James Arbib about coming on to this network and to talk about Stellar, his book Stellar, and about regeneration as a whole. So if you don't ask, they don't answer. And I asked and I got an answer. So we will hopefully have them on here to chat. So I'm super excited. Guys, we're getting ready to kick off here. So As we're kicking off, first and foremost, welcome to Regenerative Iteration. The whole idea around the series is to just not have another talking head session where all they do is talk about the rainbows and unicorns and all the wonderful things that they're doing without talking about the real hard work and the hard work it takes behind that. Because often what we think is regeneration is this wonderful, magical thing, but we get the iceberg effect really big. And we look at these projects that are out there and we're like, look how great this is. But there's a whole big amount of work underneath that water there that it takes to get those projects launched. So the whole idea of this series is to ground regeneration in reality and talk about the troubles, talk about the trials, talk about the iteration and how we can improve, talk about the collaborations and share the good stuff. But let's talk about the work it takes to get this stuff done. Today we have Lyn McDonell. I'm so excited to have her on because Lyn's been working in a very traditional way, looking at governance for a long time, and has uh, recently, we'll say that in context, and I'll let Lyn jump on this, start to look at it from a very different perspective. And then Lyn has a very unique approach with how she looks at the system as a whole, and then how she facilitates through that. So I'm really excited about this meeting today. I think it's gonna be wonderful. I'm putting in chat right now a link to the sheet so you guys can look at our reference questions that we're going to ask. And by all means, if you're like, oh my gosh, what she just say was magical, but I'm confused and I want to ask something else, put your questions in chat and I'll try to get those follow-ups as I can within the context. All right. And if you write something in chat and it's super confusing, I might just call you out because I don't know how to ask your question. And I might say, hey, Tristan, can you please go into what you're asking in chat and sort of explain it on here? The whole idea, guys, let's make sure we can get through as much as we can in this hour. Let's make sure that we keep our questions and our commentary to a minimum if we can. And let's try to make sure we can bring that value out there. So everyone knows this is recorded and I will be publishing this on the GRC YouTube channel, which we're trying to improve the commons out there so people who are interested in regeneration can learn from us and learn from us in a very applied and realistic way. So, and finally, I don't have anyone for next week. So if you know of anyone who wants to be interviewed or could be an amazing interview for next week, yo, I need them. Please, please make those intros and please give me those people that come through here. It doesn't have to be a project that's in completion. We had Colleen on here that talked about the future of her project and where she wants to go with that. And it was a wonderful discussion, right? So anyone and everyone that's working in this world who just wants to have a chat about what it takes, I'd love to have them on. So with that, again, just for Catherine, who just came in. Catherine, here's our reference sheet and chat. So you have that. You can see some of our questions. And Lyn, we're ready for you to take it away. If you don't mind, could you just give us like a 5-minute sort of background and catch us up to why we're here? And then sort of the context of some of how we'll be asking questions and how we'll present today, please.
Thanks, Sage, and thanks for asking me. It was just such a great opportunity to put me through my paces and to bring forward some of the thinking that I'm applying in my work and then translate it to you folks who I've learned so much from. So I consider it a great privilege. And just as background, I remember in grade 5 starting an organization, a club. It was the Audubon Club. And in my basement, I corralled my friends. I was the president and I made them read like certain, about birds and things. And then we'd have a discussion. And I actually, was obviously thinking about organizations very young. And then I did, through the years, I volunteered and I did my thesis on organizational stages, life stages, my master's thesis. And in my master's thesis, it kind of gets to the point of professionalization leads to this, formalization and organizations become kind of stuck. And then it's kind of decay and degeneration. And I remember, and I have it in my thesis even, that is there another stage of renewal? Is it possible for organizations to renew and reuse themselves? So this has been a lifelong project. And through the years, I've been very lucky to have had leadership positions, but also I spent some time in West Africa as a volunteer. And, so I became involved in international development, cross-cultural, sort of aware that, the Western way isn't the only way. And so there's just been so much that's gone into my my thinking. But I did become steeped in management thinking and classical or conventional governance. And in 2006, I started up the accountability group. And, and that very much was helping boards with strategy and understanding their role. And, you know, I do board orientations today all the time, and work with boards all the time. So right now I'm working with a financial regulator out of Ottawa, national financial regulator, a professional service organization, an engineering company, and like just a wide variety of organizations. And yet I come now with this new perspective that's changed everything. And this whole regenerative movement that you have been part of, my learning has just completely transformed my work. And during the pandemic, I went into a period of learning. So I'm very attuned to, as we all are, to perils of the wider system and the need for us to move forward and and to incorporate systemic concerns into the code of governance. So I'll speak more about that, but I'll just hold it there, Sage. But that's my intro, I guess.
That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Great. And that sets everything up nicely. So let's jump right into questions. And you guys, as you can see, I'm copying and pasting that welcome to Regenerative Iteration thing in chat. It's not to confuse you guys. It's just as new members are coming in, or if someone drops off and comes back in, I'm just trying to give them the link. So just ignore it if you've already been here a little bit. So Lyn, let's jump right in here. So when we look around your work with complex nonprofits, foundations, and boards with strong stakeholder tensions, what do you feel is broken in traditional governance, and where are we seeing the signs of the evolution or this evolution?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term broken because that's machine language, right? That's one of the things that I'm changing. I'm trying to avoid using mechanistic language because I think that's our issue. I see it as immature. So we have not fully developed governance. It got stuck at a certain stage, and I'll say more about that. But I want first to respect what governance has created, because lots in governance works. Like you think about, and I've used this examples often with this group, you think about safe roads and air travel and, you know, clean water and all that. That is the result of good governance, where you have the, you know, the distribution of the division of duties and the standards and accountability and that sort of structure that kind of holds up much of the world. So I believe conventional governance has many strengths. I'm not about to wipe it away and start over because it's got decades of good experience around risk mitigation and much else. So I think it needs a graft, right? What I just described is like the best of masculine linearity, right? Which is make it so. Like we know what our goal is, and we create an action and a strategy and all of the mechanisms to ensure we get there. So there's some good reasons why that's been successful and it's been over successful, but it now needs, what that is actually macro management. It's not what we need. What we need is meta governance. So what I mean by that is boards now, this is the so-called broken part, but I'd say it's immaturity, is that they have been they've been taught, it's been professionalized to worry primarily about the organization and immediate stakeholders or shareholders, and not to link up to the systemic realities. So we need to have this level of systemic awareness about the contribution or the degradation that is happening to that other layer, and to make that link. And that is where I put my work, is this transition between business as usual organizations and the kind of H2 plus, if you know that sort of terminology of 3 horizons, of what it is that we need to do to transition. But first you have to turn the lights on, right? Like I always see it as the boards are in a room and they just see the reports that go by. They have a very insular view, and they're encouraged to have that sort of in their fiduciary responsibility. But in fact, you know, the world is open and it's much more permeable, and that they are affecting everything. So lots in governance has worked, but as things start to cascade, and I do think that we're, for a period of meta disruption, then we have to develop new capabilities on the board, and they have to see them as part of governance, because and I'll end here, is that what happened, and there's some good history here I can share with you if you were interested, but what happened was that, particularly in the 80s and 90s, is that governance became professionalized, and it became then very much taken over by, not part of it, I suppose, as well, the consulting industry, who started to say, here's what good governance is, and it was codified. So that is very, it is pretty tough, because it's also legally rooted now. So we have to evolve governance code, which is why I work, or want to work, at the very nature of what is good governance. And good governance is surrounded by a living world and contributing usefully to it, and looking after most basic things. Like at the end of the day, and we're starting to feel like that's a potential future, is that we have to sort of turn the ship, but we've not done this before. We've never had this redirection of governance itself to life, and that's kind of what's needed now.
That was an awesome answer. That was just like, all I can see is like head nods in chat for everything you're talking about there. So very well done. I think we could have sidebar discussions on meta disruptions, or guys, so you don't know, Lyn's going to be heading over into Michelle's series after this to talk about regenerative governance in here, and maybe that's one of the things that they can talk about, some of this meta disruption on here. So or we'll just have to have a follow-up for the conversation, or for the topics they don't have. So beyond theory, in a world where change is exponential, what practices help a board stay future ready?
Let me tell you first what traditional organizations are doing. And I want to keep referencing back there, because it's kind of our starting position, right? Like, so I see this community, and I so appreciate it. You kind of work in Horizon 3, or clearly Horizon 2+. I'm kind of back with the business as usual folks. So here's what they are doing. Exponential change. Absolutely, everybody's feeling it. I could talk about the not-for-profit and the companies. There's obviously differences, but what I think everybody's doing now is scanning and really updating all of their projections on all scores. So it's financial, it's clients and customers, it's their markets, it's supplier resilience. It's like everybody's sort of realizing that the whole world is changing. It's quite present in all of the conferences and so forth that are being held, this kind of big disruptions. And so what they do is they, and so this is now the new board, work is asking management to create these scenarios of potential scenarios, and then which ones are the most in the risk matrix, there's likelihood and impact, and which ones should be tabletop, exercises. How would we respond? Let's try to do a real life kind of, play out of what it would look like, stress testing. So that's a lot of what the corporate side is doing. And on the not-for-profit, and Michelle and others will have more insight on this, but there's a dizzying loss of talent and capability in that sector because of loss of funding. Plus, there's a lot of retirements of people in leadership positions who are saying it's time for me to move on, and that next layer isn't always ready. So now there's a lot of consolidations, there's a lot of collaborations, there's some really good things that are happening, but there's a tremendous squeeze, and this is going to be exacerbated as we hit some of the waves that are coming. So it's a time to really, I will say that I try, now I don't think in sectors so much. I think we're all in this, and I think there needs to be less siloing and much more togetherness on the issues, and not just industry by industry, sector by sector. We need to address things together. So I'd say tabletop exercises for sure. Now, in terms of my work, so what am I doing? How do I help boards be future ready? You will know, and I'll put in the chat as soon as I can, that I I don't know who could know everybody's business, but I do know that lenses are really important now. Thinking lenses, seeing lenses, because I think if you see something and you suddenly see it in a new way, you can't unsee it. So there's 6 thinking frames that I curated. I can't say I invented them, but they're pretty important, I think, and they're really useful. One is, of course, systems thinking, like nesting a board, making sure the board has a view of its nestedness in other systems, its relationality. The second is, time horizons, 3-horizon thinking, I think is really useful. Multi-capitals, like introducing multi-capitals, the idea of there's stocks and flows of different capitals, and decisions affect different things in different ways. And we're wanting to, generate with our decisions, appreciation of certain, the spiritual capital and cultural and social, and just how important all of that soft stuff is. Another one is appreciation of cycles and seasons and conditions as being key, because the boards cannot compel, they can only create conditions. So I think this whole idea of having them be mindful of what are the conditions of leadership and structure and so forth, and culture. And finally, what I call new story, which is new co-creative meaning making, that there's a stepping back from what has been the old narrative, and boards, not that they write a new one, because that's old strategic planning. Instead, that they realize that the new one is being written around them and they have to fit into it, that there's a new story that's evolving and they have to latch on to that. So there's so much there, but I'm sneaking it in. Like, people ask me to deal with issues that they're encountering, or I do board orientation. So now I'm taking each strategic planning, risk management, oversight of management, stakeholder relations. I'm taking each one and I'm now trying to graft regenerative thinking into board responsibilities. And I want to do more work on that, but you have to be sneaky, because no one's going to call me up and ask for regenerative governance, I don't think, but they will accept it if they can see it as part of their responsibilities.
And that's part of what we're going to talk about.
Once we're getting on governance. Sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
That's what we're going to, part of what we're going to like sort of help
Yes.
piece together next week as we compare and see where do regenerative governance principles fit or not fit, and what practices can make it fit. That's just a commercial for next week.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, we want to dig into that. There'll be less me talking, more you giving some guidance from your point of view.
I think your 6 pillars, I think we could have a session on each one of those themselves. Yeah. I think that to be fair, you need to extend those outside of just the board of those nonprofits, but into the nonprofits themselves, because I see too many nonprofits that don't really understand how they fit in the ecosystem around them. They think they have an idea, but they haven't run through these types of exercises to really frame up holistically where do they think they fit and where do they actually fit. So I love everything I heard, and I think that definitely needs to be expanded in a lot of ways. Outside of just governance, I should say. Any follow-ons before we move on to the next topic?
I have
Go ahead, Michelle.
Couple of things. Nonprofit boards, I've worked more with nonprofit boards than, well, I don't guess I've worked for any corporate boards really, with any corporate boards, but nonprofit governance is definitely going through a reimagination. There's a lot of problems with finding board members. They're all volunteer board members, typically, unless you're the NRA and then you can pay your board members or something. But for the most part, board members are volunteer. And one of the pinch points, and I wonder how okay, so one of the things you said is boards can't compel. And yet, for at least a nonprofit board, and I'm thinking for a corporate board, a CEO gets fired, right? Like a board, an executive director of a nonprofit organization can be fired. Now, it's a big pain in the butt for the board to have to do that and then do a search and do all that. And it's so like dysfunction can continue on and on for a while until things really break. And then a board is stuck with a really unpleasant job. But for me, sort of when we were talking about those patterns and that geometry, that pinch point, so that there's also this siloing of the board from the work, from the company, from the rest of the company, it seems to me. I'm happy to be told I'm wrong about this, because I don't know, but I know in nonprofit boards, there's this siloing of the board often from the rest of the organization. And that, pinch point is that ED. And so there's a restructuring there. It's not so much get rid of the board. Maybe someday that would figure out that those jobs could be done in some other structure, but that's a siloing. So that's one thing that, and then there was something else, but I've forgotten it right now.
Michelle, we'll come back to
here
that.
it is. Here's the
oh,
other thing. The other thing with
Yeah.
nonprofits, so much of like doing the work of seeing how you fit in the ecosystem. To the degree that nonprofits can get funding to do strategic planning at all, or anything like it. So then there's that's a funding issue for a nonprofit. And then to be able to have the resources to do something, it's like, well, maybe it's not the old way strategic planning, but maybe it's a different thing that sort of still lets us know where we are and where we want to go and how we fit, and it gets a new name. But I'm just going to say the other reason that doesn't happen a lot of the time is funders, finding the funders who fund it.
Lynn, did you want to respond before I ask the next one?
Yeah, I mean, the funding squeeze and trying to get strategy, like it's a bit of a lot of them are really struggling. The point about board members and finding board members is really true.
Is that true in standard governance in companies as well?
No, not as much so. No, because there's compensation involved, and people can make their living serving on boards. So
wow.
Yeah. Let's go to the next question, because there's one that I think I can circle back to what Michelle's saying. Yeah. And
guys, we're halfway through this and we're on question 3. So we got a lot of questions left. So let's keep going here. What you use the term perspectival systems thinking. What does that look like inside a boardroom? And can you possibly walk us through a moment where this showed up in practicality?
I love this question because it really takes you right into the boardroom. And so I think boards should be set up for wicked problems. So lots can be, resolved at team levels for sure. But where you have a real ethical or structural or irreversible decisions, that's really, I called it the other day in this group, that boards are chambers of wisdom, ideally. So a wicked problem has no single solution. It has no stopping rule. It's not like you can solve it. It just keeps going on and on. It's very dynamic. Everything's related. It's nonlinear. And we can only respond to them, not solve them. And that's where we are now. And that's where boards, I think, do the true governance work of, setting direction, velocity, use of energy, like these very high level ideas about, where do you go with something? So I'll give you 2 examples, or one good example, I think. I've served on hospital board for many years, and it's a very multi-stakeholder environment. There's patients, there's staff, there's the medical staff who aren't part of the staff of the hospital. They are, here in Canada anyway, they like come in and use the hospital, but they're not controlled by the hospital by any means. And but I want to use the example of a state university client. So this would be a U.S. client that I worked with, and we're really looking here at sort of education, colleges and universities. So colleges and universities, in particular, academia, but especially, are very, very tied up structurally. They are very challenging environments. Oh my gosh, right? Because sometimes they have what's called a bicameral structure, which is that the faculty themselves have a whole governance structure, and then there's a corporate structure for the sort of more shared back office services and leadership and some fundraising and so forth. And so this was a case for a state university that I developed with the chair there, or the vice chair there. And we pulled together this case that was so real that we had to pull it back because we wouldn't have time to debrief it. It was so present for them. And and this is true for many universities, there's structural deficits, that there's declining enrollment and revenue. You know, there's more online, they have a lot of stake in buildings and so forth. So there's capital that they have to maintain. That if they have to find funding quickly or revenue or savings quickly, there's timing issues, there's unions, there's contracts, there's other relational agreements, there's the students and their morale, their expectations, what has been promised to them, there's fairness and values, there's funding constraints, perhaps, you know, the state, or in Canada, you know, the provincial government has expectations and performance agreements and corridors that they use that they have to fall within. There's like integrity of disciplines and departments. Like if you take something out, does it make other things, you know, not as steady in terms of the learning of the students, communications on it, long-term sustainability. I mean, there's a case where multi-perspectival thinking is right in the room and it's hot and the board has to make some decisions, and it's not easy, it's not straightforward, and there's no good answer, there's just less bad ones. So what do? That's the reason why you have a board with all these perspectives, is because people will see it in different ways, and that conversation at the board level is the thinking and wisdom that's needed. The board has, you know, two main obligations to the organization. One is sustainability, that you know, this is my phrase, or you could decide whether you like it, but it's like the staff is responsible. This is no longer words that I use, but it'll help. The staff is responsible for the performance of an organization, and the board is responsible for its health and its long-term vitality. So the board has an obligation for that long-term sustainability. It has to make decisions that keep the university or the college afloat over time, and relevance, that they have to make sure that because that's part of sustainability, they have to make sure that the organization and what they offer is relevant. And then take care of people through that. But that is such a good example, Sage and everyone, of just how thorny it can be at the board. And sometimes you don't, you know, it's not a task that you welcome. It's like, oh my gosh, we have to make a really tough decision. Does that help in terms of multi-perspectival thinking?
Yeah, that was massive. That was massive, and I can definitely see the value. Thank you. Michelle had a comment in chat, having said about nonprofits. Well, oh, this is just a follow-up. Okay. Michelle, did you want to come off mute and talk about that, or just leave it in?
There's so much more to get to. I just wanted to make sure, Lynn, like what I really like, I think there's a lot in common with those nonprofit boards. I was talking about the differences, but they struggle more alike than different, I think.
Yeah,
because of the structure of organizations, because of the structure of, you know, like you said, this like gotten codified this way, and now that just gets repeated. And anyway,
Dennis had
I
an
think
interesting question asking about activist board members and stakeholders. Is that primarily different in some of these ways that we see this, or is that some of the same problems what we're talking about sort of is systemic across nonprofits?
Activist shareholders are scaring the bejesus out of the corporate scene because they can organize and come forward, and you know, their goals are sometimes short-term thinking. They don't necessarily have the long-term. So I mean, I think when I see a lot of chatter on the corporate side about the handling and preparedness and all of that. So not so much on the they're not as well organized on the not-for-profit side. They certainly can come out at annual meetings depending on your membership, you know, structure. But yeah, I think it's one of those discouraging factors for what it is we are trying to do in terms of bringing regenerative thinking, is this kind of sniping the heels of boards to perform. And it has a lot to do with, like, this is part of the history of the professionalization of governance and the way it went off track in the 90s to be more about profit for the corporate than about sort of sustainability long term. So I consider them a high irritant as well as an obstacle. There's very, well, activists are also on the ecological side, thank goodness, like the environmental activists for sure are coming forward. So that's good. So I think I've spoken more about the ones that are sort of profit oriented, but yeah, they're there. It's not something I concentrate on myself or have much experience in handling, truthfully, but I'm aware of them.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question here. We're on to number 4 for those following on the sheet. How do you teach ecological thinking to leaders who are primarily functionality or operationally trained? How do we expand those horizons?
Yeah, and you asked, like, metaphors and exercises. I mean, certainly, like, we can use trees and gardens and families and all of those beautiful metaphors, and I do think living language needs to be inserted into. I've got my own little list of, words I don't use and words instead I try to. And I saw a little note from Catherine around, circle of caring, and like just starting to change our language is important. So that's true. But when I was thinking about this question, I thought boards are already in ecosystems. We just need to have them see them better. So COVID, for example, what a education that was in systemic thinking for everybody. And I'm not sure COVID and the whole illumination of the interconnections of everything was well debriefed in boardrooms so that they took those learnings and have applied them forward. But I think that knowledge of, or that illumination of all of the interconnections, be it supply chain or effect on employees, effect on schoolwork, teenagers and children not feeling as so, there's so much there. So I think we need to ideally nest our education in the reality that they are experiencing. And in fact, what I love about sort of the systemic education movement, and I'm thinking of things like Flourishing Business Canvas or, resources, events and actors mapping, or ripple effects, what is it called? Ripple maps, and all of those, which are in the systemic sort of community, the systems thinking community. What I think is that boards don't have time to do those. They won't do it. I mean, they have no patience, for one thing, because they have no time. And if anything seems really a little bit, I don't know, out there, they won't respect it. But they should be, all those tools, the outcomes, the charts should be brought into the boardroom and used as mapping. Here's our organizational ecosystem. So they, it's like they don't want to see the chicken, they want to see the eggs, right? So I think the eggs need to be brought in. But I also thought too, thick data. So, Nora Bateson, and sort of bringing in lived experience, having people talk to the board about, what the effect of and the impact of the work that's being done, be it in the corporate or not-for-profit side, is really critical. I love panels for that reason. I've never seen a panel of stakeholders be an unsuccessful session in terms of board learning. And sometimes it's the board itself and their setting, which can be important. If any of you are facilitators, you know how your heart sinks when you find out that you're having the meeting in a basement with no windows, right? Like when you are in a basement with no windows, try to have a creative meeting. It's very difficult, right? Years ago, I was part of an organization that made big changes over time, evolutionary type changes. And there was 2 or 3 retreats in the Rocky Mountains at Banff Center. And I know in my gut that those big decisions were taken because people could step outside and see a horizon and see far, and that the conversation inside had fresh air around it, right? And it was new thinking. So we need to remember that boards themselves are living beings, in conversation. And if we can place them in a place where they sense their own vitality and power of possibility, then that's really powerful. So ecological thinking. I think they're already in an ecosystem. We need to illuminate it, and we need to pick up the board and take them out of machine thinking.
Love it. That was a great answer. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, next question. So I really when we're going to talk about place-based governance, we're on question number 5 here. So I'd like to expand this. Like, how do you bring in land or community? How do you bring in representation into a board that is needed but maybe doesn't represent to a person, right? How do you bring in place-based representation or eco-city representation into a board outside of just illumination that they're part of this? How do you bring that into the context of, let's consider that as part of our decision making?
I must say how fun this is for me. Thank you so much for all these great questions. Place-based governance is going to be the new scaffold of the future, right? Like, for sure. Like, I don't think we've realized it yet, but it is part of the new code, because as Colleen and others will tell us, is that it will be about the sustainability of people in reasonable proximity to each other, getting what they need, essentially, and so forth, right? So I know that's true. I know that's going to be Horizon 3, still with global connections. But so place-based governance and bringing nature in, I think, is the future. It's like right now, though, it feels like it's a train that has, you can't even hear the whistle yet in the boardroom. You know, you just can't. Yeah. It's just way down the track. Michelle, did you have a thought?
Well, it just isn't the like, I think about community, like thinking about the ecosystem in which the board, the company, the board works, and the communities that the board's business practices impact.
That's right.
And that being, that's to me what would be, that's what's stimulated by this question. And up to now, the only way for doing that is through like activism that is trying to do corporate corporate like I think about the forest organizations that have these multi-stakeholder, multi-approaches, and one of them is, let's buy a place at the stakeholder at the big annual meeting and then stand up and yell at the boards to kind of commit. Do you know, like that's the only way for that community to get heard now that I know of. That's what comes to mind for me. So
yeah,
that's not ideal. Like what we'd like is for somehow that those impacts and that to be one of that multi-perspective.
That's right.
Am I in the right context? Am I thinking about the right thing?
And I also realize that sometimes I exaggerate to make a point. So when I say that the whole place-based governance is a train whistle that you haven't even heard yet, it hasn't come down the track. It's really, I'm talking about probably like the whole notion of what is good governance. Is good governance yet doesn't incorporate place. It incorporates just, remember that organization is like a bubble. And if you just like have a really good, bubbles, inside, then you're good, right? So, so I did exaggerate, but you're right. I mean, certainly, community representatives, all of these consultations with different communities prior to big projects, all of this is about, being more sensitive. But I want to share with you,
I don't think you were exaggerating. I do think it's a train whistle that hasn't made it into the bubble yet, to mix all the metaphors. But
what I just put in the chat is where Faith in Nature, it's an organization in the UK. They did put and I know Gil's had some interest in this kind of thing, where they did put a board member on the board to represent nature, to bring nature into the room. And they give some guidance about, how that person can be equipped and so forth. And I think that sort of, questioning stage, going back to your, how do you see a role for place-based governance? It's going to be, also questions from the board around how does our work fit into the place here? Like, what are we affecting? Are we helping this community? Are we not? So there's a whole bunch of questions there. It's probably, I would say that there's others in this community who will be much stronger in this question than I am. I'm still trying to drag them along to the ecological thinking, let alone trying to have, but I think reality will be the forcing function. You know, the whole bioregional movement at some point is going to meet the need for new, and it's happening in Canada in a way, because with tariffs, you know, which have been injurious to Canadian businesses, there's all kinds of reconfiguration where organizations and companies are trying to get their needs met without sourcing from the US. So this is like practice run, like COVID was, that practice run for developing new relationships for sustainability and getting by. So I think it's going to be reality that forces us, but the Horizon 3 work that regenerative people do is really important. I'll leave it at that, Sage. Some good questions yet to come.
That was great. I'm looking at chat here and see if anyone had any follow-ups. I think we're going to move on to the next one. If you have a follow-up real quick, raise your hand and I'll get to you. If not, I'm moving on to the next question. I love play space, by the way. And I think play space opens up a whole other door to how do we fit into that ecosystem. Because once we try to figure out that, there's a lot of pruning we have to do and a lot of changes maybe we have to do within those organizations as well. So next question here is, what is the biggest mindset shift directors need to make in order to steward regenerative outcomes? Is there tension between accountability and emergence in this shift?
I can speak personally. So when I started connecting with the regenerative community and I went to Fritjof Capra's course, it was like, oh my, you know, obviously, like it was like a blinding glimpse of the obvious, right? That there's two organizations in a way. There's the formal one, which is paper and roles and policy. And then there's the living, energetic one. And the only one really that has the potential for regeneration is the living, energetic, relational one between people. It's not, the other is just sculpture, right? The other is just paper sculpture. And so while paper sculpture and those structures create affordances and obstacles, if we're going to change an organization or regenerate it, we turn to the informal, we turn to the people, we turn to the relationships between. And what governance needs to do is to kind of step back and be clear about sort of, you know, what some enabling constraints, but not be so on top of everything. I think we're so burdened, and I have another commentary on that elsewhere, you know, using like Gulliver, you know, like the informal organization is held down by like Gulliver, by the Lilliputians, and we need to like release a lot of the policies and constraints to but my main answer there is to see organizations as energetic living systems, and that I think changes how we lead, and to value the informal. I mean, and the culture. I mean, many people got there before me. I mean, I was so schooled in the other that it was like a revelation to me. I do think AI has a role to play here. I think it's created capabilities that we didn't have before. So that's one of my explorations is, yes, that whole living system and informality and the potential there. But I also see AI as somehow part of this new living systems choreography. I'm not sure how. So I'll leave that at that.
That's wonderful. Everyone, we're quickly approaching the last 10 minutes of our chat today. So we're going to move on to a little more fast questions and answers here. So we're going to try to get through the rest of these if we can. And if we don't, we do have a buffer today. I do not have a meeting right after this, so we will continue on if the groups wants to hang around or has any following questions. I don't see any questions in chat, so I'm going to move on to the next one. So you've held an executive and board roles. What's changed most in the boardroom conversation since you've begun? Actually, I think we've kind of like uncovered this question throughout all of our conversation. Do you have anything to add to this one? I'm on number 7 here. Anything you want to highlight?
I do, because I thought about that and I realized it's like the blind man and the elephant. I can only speak sort of from my experience, and it's obviously limited, and it's very based in organizations I've been involved in, and then also what I've observed, and of course, very Western governance. So, but what I think is true is that, so I'm going to go back to 80s and the 90s, let's say, and I think the culture of an organization at that time, there was more teamwork between the staff and the board, and that there was it's almost like a family feeling, like there was accountability to the board, like the board stepped into their role when they were in a meeting. But, you know, we used to like, you know, go off and dance together, you know, until midnight. And then like there was a certain informality of relationship that allowed, and spending time together, that allowed the candor in the boardroom. And it was kind of a more purposeful together team. And then remember, I've tracked back what I think was when governance started to go off the rails of authenticity a bit, would be in the 90s and early 2000s, with some of the governance failures, which started to bulk up the whole professional consulting industry. And so we had increased attention to risk, to topics like cybersecurity more recently, more compliance. There's like really clear division of duties, greater reliance on the CEO, more distance, all of that stuff. What it did is that I think it fractured something in the soul of the organization, as all being in this together with the staff. Now, remember, I'm speaking from my personal experience, so I know this isn't necessarily universal, but the staff being the agents of getting stuff done for the board, but not this separation. So I think that's part of our issue, and that's why you get this increasing. And I'm going to speak on the corporate side, sort of increasing treatment of individuals or the human resources as something that's statistically present. What's our turnover rate? You know, what is our latest engagement surveys? What do they say? It's all kind of more objectified, when before they would know because they were closer. Lots there.
I love it. I love it. Weston, you had a really long question on here. Could you come out and ask that pretty quick if you want to, if that's okay?
Sure.
Yeah, that looks like an interesting one.
Yeah, please, sir.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm working with like a 60 org network, and probably like 30 of them are like the standard generic Western white people board. But then the other 30 used like pretty different methodologies. Some don't really have much of a methodology. They're like, you know, new community action groups, especially underserved communities. And then there's like 5 that are indigenous that use like Peace Circle and like kind of in the consent direction. And I'm tasked with how do we come to a decision on what our decision making model will be. So I'm coming up with like a game for it, but I wanted to get an idea of, in your experience, whether you've done this yourself or whether you've seen other people do this as facilitators, how a lower friction kind of interaction can then lead to how this, you know, a 60 organization network can come to agreement about things.
Oh man, Weston, that's such a good question. And yeah, and that one actually would be a great one to even just concentrate on, Michelle, in the governance. And I'll give some room for you in a moment for you, Michelle. But what I wanted to acknowledge is just how cool that is, but how challenging that is. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, it's almost like you have to slow down, like, you know, because when you have that many groups, there's this like, what is that? Go fast, go alone, go together. You know, you have to really slow down and then kind of build trust. So this actual next question, as you know, Sage, and if you can see on the thing, was about collaboration. And it's like common vision, you know, time, attention, some leadership, all those things become important, but trust becomes incredibly important. And then realizing all those nodes that are sitting around each have a network that they want to relate to, and they have to account to, and they feel like they have to consult. So I think it becomes, this is my view, there's lots more experience in this room probably, and I think even Dennis might also have some of this, but it's thinking about not just the group that's in the room, but all of it's like an education, or not an awareness of what that whole collective is trying to do, but sort of seeing that that these are just agents of this larger community, and they are your real target group. But I can appreciate how challenging it is, and simple principles will work best. Like, and there's some experience around that. Like, what are the heuristics, if you like? What are those key protocols that you try to apply in every situation, but they're stated very high level as guidance. They're not fixed, but they kind of guide the group, and they are adaptive. But Michelle, do you have any thoughts on this one? Because this feels like more your work.
So many.
And actually, I see we're near the end, so I'm
many, and we're near the end. I know of a game that we've used. It's a simulation that sort of unveils the relationships and different cultures in the room, which leads basically people to choosing, consent-based decision making. And then Weston, we're not limiting it to the sociocratic method of consent decision making. So if you want to talk about that another offline at that level of governance, I'll be
totally.
happy to talk with you.
I'll reach out to you separately.
And Weston, I mean, it depends in part around, do you have a deadline of something you need to do? Or is it a long trust building process for this collective? And if it's the former, it's going to be a little different. If it's the latter, you're on a longer time frame. So, and if there is something that's more immediate, then that is put on the table, and asking questions is always better than providing answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we approach this task together, given that we have to make a decision by blah blah? And but good luck, because I think that's one of the most challenging governance situations.
Totally. Yeah, thank you.
I think there could be a good follow-on sidebar with all three of you guys that we'd all probably love to be flies on the wall and learn and glean some knowledge. We're down to our last three questions here, so
yeah, we can do them quick.
What questions should boards be asking but often don't?
Range of considerations, impacts, assumptions behind plans. But I have a magic question. This is the question you can ask in a board always. Like, it's like the one question you can always ask of anything. And here it is. What questions should we be asking here? It's so obvious, right? So you can ask, like, getting questions on the table is really important. Instead of, like, boards move through things too swiftly because they want to, they have an agenda and they only have so much time. But even just asking the question of what questions should we be asking here is a slow down moment to make sure the board is not sleepy, right? It's not just sleepwalking. I'll leave it at that.
I love it. I love it. Michelle had another one in chat. What will be impacted by our decision? I love it. Or
who will be impacted?
Sorry, who?
Who will be impacted?
Who and what? Yeah.
What gives you hope right now in the realm of governance and regeneration and your whole ecosystem that you go in and out of across multiple agencies?
I think the purpose movement is gaining steam, and I think the Europe is farther ahead than us in kind of thinking in terms of circular and all of those sorts of things. So I think that's good. But what gives me most hope is that it feels open right now. And maybe I'm projecting, but I think everyone's kind of knowing that what we're doing isn't working. So I think there's more openness now to new approaches. And I consider, dear folks, you as systemic thinkers as really the leading edge. I mean, I would say we need a board education movement. We need to continue to build H3 solutions. And there's people on this call that are doing that. And we absolutely need that. But there's a part of this community that I think that needs to reach into the H1, the business as usual, and give them some new lenses and ways of thinking. Because when I do that, at least in my little way, I see incredible, like, that's really helpful. And yeah, I'm seeing it a new way. And so I think it's the openness. of the moment. And as I said before, reality will be a forcing function. So sadly, governance is going to be up leveled real soon.
Let me ask you a quick question as a follow-up. How do we ensure that we're part of the solution and not part of the noise of the problem when we're working with these emerging groups?
Well, here's where I have a very particular approach that not everyone will share or should share, because I think we all play different roles. But for me, I don't go in, and Gil knows this, others know this, I don't go in with a blame or shame. I rather kind of side by side, how are we going to address this? And I try to be non-judgmental and so being part of the solution is not pointing and saying you're the problem, because that just creates defensiveness, and then they close down and they feel like they're being attacked. So who's they? It's like, you know, the classic board director group, I guess. But I think it's about suggesting that there's a spaciousness in thinking that's possible in the systemic kind of sharing of assets and possibilities, and that imaginative but also real space of conversation, of trying to solve things together. That's much more empowering and positive and amazing than sort of staying in that bubble. So I'm very much about pointing to that, and just leaving aside my own critiques, because they don't fit in that setting.
If you had a room full of emerging board leaders, what's the one principle you would leave them with?
What a good question. I'd say it's your organization in 10 years, so it's your organization now, because boards look after the future and you are the agent of the future. So it would be about taking their empowerment. Like it's like there's a vacuum to be filled. Don't be shy. You need to bring in your lightness. You need to bring in your irreverence. Bring your gifts. I think it would be about empowerment and knowing that they are welcomed in the boardroom in a way that, you know, old folks like me aren't, because people know that they are the future. So they should speak from that. They don't have to fit in. They do have to have intergenerational kind of working groups on things. We do, you know, they can't just come in and just opine, but they need to link up and to figure it out. But, you know, I would just empower them like crazy. How fun. Thanks, Sage. Thanks, everybody.
That was awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. This concludes our interview with Lyn. Lyn, you were like awesome. Oh my gosh, you were in your zone of genius throughout all of this. And this is a blessing for all of us. Thank you so much for coming on today. Thank
So
you
much
all
worth
of you for
listening
coming on and
again.
asking so many great questions. If you want to show your genius in this type of format, if you want to be interviewed and any of this, I need speakers. I absolutely need speakers. I don't have anyone for next week. I left my email in chat. Email me. Let's talk. Let's get you on here and let's show off and let's talk about how you're impacting the world and let's learn from you. So thank you all for coming today. Lyn, again, thank you so much. You're wonderful, guys. Lyn's going to be going on to Michelle's series next week for governance. So Michelle, do you want to introduce that and sort of like where you guys are going with this, or one of you? I'm sorry.
Michelle's good.
Okay.
Yeah, our Regenerates governance call is for talking about and learning about what it means to govern regeneratively, and what regenerative initiatives, you know, what kind of governance works to keep regenerative initiatives regenerative. And so we have developed some regenerative governance principles based on the regenerative principles and regeneration principles, and we're working with those. So what we're going to do next week is see how does the standard governance fit, what fits and what doesn't fit, and what can be made, you know, what can be done to bring more of that alive, some of these exercises, structures, patterns, you know.
We're retrofitting, aren't we? Like we're like retrofitting governance,
and
regeneration into governance.
Right, and I have to think that any amount is helpful. You know, any amount of forward movement helps. So we hope that we can help
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity just to voice it. So I'm very grateful, and to you, Sage, and to all of you. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks, Lyn.
Thanks, everyone.
100%
Have a
agree
wonderful
with
day,
that.
everyone.
Yeah, 100% agree with the empathy, you know, that you come into these boards with, because so much of what they hear, like from that activist standpoint, is the blame, right? Is the stop it, is the, you know, so it's all within, again, a context that's like
Michelle, there's a question
forcing.
in chat for you, just so you know.
Anyway, yeah, we all got to go. Are you tracking the biofire? Yeah, I am tracking it. Actually, Asheville's got, because of after Hurricane Helene, we're one of the regenerative finance, you know, we're in that, or there's a group here that's in that world thinking about that. So
Yeah, I just mentioned that because there's a whole international flurry of interconnected conferences that have been happening or coming up in, I guess, September